Okay, ladies and gentlemen, apologies for the delay. We have had a few changes in our agenda, but nonetheless, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this session, which explores the challenges of designing rural transport networks that are both socially and economically inclusive. Now, my name's Juliet Foster, and I'm joined by a panel of guests who are experts in this particular field. Now, over the next hour and a half, we will be analysing some of the many issues that arise from this subject, including the financial costs of operating transport systems in low population areas, how technology can bridge the gap between urban and rural systems, and whether it's possible to construct a transport network that upholds the principles of inclusiveness. So before the discussion begins, I'd like to give you an idea of how this session will work. Our guests will give a short introduction of a few minutes in which they will describe their area of expertise and the issues on which they're focused. Afterwards, there will be a discussion, and at the end of that, you, the audience, will be given an opportunity to put your questions to the panel. There will be people standing by with microphones, and if you want to ask a question, then please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. It would also be helpful if you could say who you are and give the name of the organisation or publication that you represent. So that's what's going to happen. And let's begin by meeting, really, the first of our speakers. Now, we had hoped to be joined today by Elizabeth de Peters, who's the Minister of Transport for South Africa, but unfortunately, she has taken ill. Thankfully, Themba Tenza, who's the Chief Director of Research and Innovation at that ministry, has agreed to step in on her behalf. So, sir, the floor is now yours.
Good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thanks to the moderator. On the question of rural transport, the emphasis being on the rural, the first point I would like to make is that South Africa's position is unique, like all our countries could be, because of our past and also because of the spatial planning that we had in the past. And our communities in the rural areas are perhaps one of the most commuting communities between rural and urban during holiday times and peak times. And we do not have a lot of transport in the rural areas because it was biased a lot towards mining towns and also manufacturing towns. So that's the situation for the rural areas in our country. And more than 50% of people are in the rural areas, but some of them are dual citizens because they migrate to work during the week and during the big times, and then they go back home, and that's how it is. And yeah, we do have a rural transport strategy as a ministry, which we are implementing, and the main thing that we would like to have is focused technologies that will assist with take-up on timing as well as shortening the distances and between train stations and the investments that we have. We have a passenger rail agency of South Africa that has committed to improve its refurbishment of rolling stock. And that is a very big thing that we have done in South Africa for the rail side, also to improve on the rural transport. And on the road sides, we have secondary networks, but there are very few roads, and we rely a lot on what we now call non-motorized transport systems, and also on the cycling for school children that are very far from the centers of town or amenities in the rural areas. So yeah, I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Themba Tenza, who's the Chief Director of Research and Innovation at the Ministry of Transport for South Africa. Now, before his appointment as Vice Minister of Transport, Christian Bowen served as an advisor to the Ministry of Transport and Telecommunications. He was also a partner at the Nguyen Renewable Energy Company and was Parliamentary Counsel of the various parliamentary blocks of Congress in the areas of transport, public works and telecommunications. An engineer by training, Christian Bowen has been a key figure in highlighting the role that new vehicle efficiency standards have played in reducing carbon emissions and air pollution in Chile. Christian Bowen, Deputy Minister of Transport, the floor is now yours. Go for it.
Let me try this way. You have a clicker here, so it's okay here?
That's great.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to speak about from the services perspective, more than infrastructure here. And we're going to show you one application, one possible solution for facing the problem of inclusive transport for low-density rural areas. First of all, I'm going to introduce you Chile, if you don't know. Chile is a long and thin country. If you put in the map of Europe, you could have a country going from Norway to North Africa. We have 17 million people living in Chile, but 40% of the people are living in Santiago, the capital. That is important for what I'm going to say after this. And 87% of the population are living in cities. This is a phenomenon that is happening around the world of people moving from the countryside to cities, and this is an important thing to be said. But we also have more than 2 million people living in areas with an average density of 3 people per square kilometer, and with a rough landscape, with fjords, lakes, ocean, mountains, deserts. And this is a thing that you should consider when you want to connect people, because you need to face these geographical barriers. And the issue of having 2 million people living in isolated areas that need to be connected transform this problem in a problem of a social problem, an important social issue. And that is the way in which we are facing this problem, considering that connecting these people, it's much more, it has a much higher cost than moving people in cities per passenger, obviously. So we created in 2009 a program called Connectivity Subsidy Program. And the idea here is to subsidize the offer of transportation in these unconnected areas in order to guarantee that people in Chile can be connected by some of means of transportation, but at the same time assuring the provision of this kind of transportation by the private sector. So we are investing about $60 million per year in these services that can be by road, by rail, air, and water. And water, I mean lakes and oceans. We have an average subsidy per passenger per trip of $2.6, which is not so high, but still is an important amount of money, because we have an annual demand of more than 20 million passengers and the potential to benefit about 900,000 people. This is a bus. It's one of the possible kind of services. And I'm going to show you some examples. We have a little ship over here, a ferry, going from one island to another town. And let me speak about a big service, and I'm going to show you after that a small one. This is a very strategic service, because it goes from Caleta Tortel, that is, I know if I have here, Caleta Tortel to Puerto Natales by ship, covering all this zone with a lot of fjords, where, as you can see, you can't go through land. So if you wanted to go from Caleta Tortel to Puerto Natales, this is close to the Antarctica, close to Ushuaia in Argentina. You needed to pass through Argentina for going there. So we are connecting Chile through Chile, and this was started the last week, and it was the first. This is the ship that covers that 40 hours by water trip. So if you want to go there, please pay attention to the 40 hours that you will need to do. But also we have free school transportation, and this is a very interesting program, because we are moving students from rural areas for going to the school for free. People that sometimes needed to do this by biking, by walking, and sometimes that was a very important issue in the assistance of people, attendance of people to the schools. And this is a very interesting example for me. We are moving from Cabrero to Los Angeles. This is two cities, a town and a city in the central zone of Chile. And we're covering each day 13 young people with Down syndrome from the town of Cabrero to the city of Los Angeles. And this obviously is a symbol of inclusion and opportunities that we are giving to these young people that have new opportunities of program and school that they didn't have before of this program. And let me finish this short presentation, because we are going to speak about this in the future, in the next minutes, but some lessons learned. First of all, you need to be very aware, if you want to implement a program like this one, about the political opportunities. We have the implementation of the public transportation system of Santiago, where 40% of the people of Chile are living. And we realized that after a few days that it was necessary a subsidy in order to provide a good public transportation system. But congressmen of other regions started to push for the same amount of money to be destined for the rest of the country. So finally we had the resources to start a program like this one, and other infrastructure and things about transportation in regions. So be aware about the opportunities that political context can give you. And it's not required to have a high cost per passenger per trip. What you need is to promote a competitive environment for operators in order to have enough services at the lowest possible price. If not, this could be obviously a big, how can I say this, una hemorragia, ¿cómo digo eso? An hemorrhage of a bleeding of money, and that would be not very good. And the third thing, and the most important, is you need to be convinced that the investment is worth making. When you're investing in these people, you're investing in opportunities, you're investing in creating a more equal country, you're investing in creating high quality of life for people, and you're investing in a better country, and that is an important thing. This is an important amount of money, but it's enough worth to do it and to have the effort to destine these resources to this kind of services. So we're going to keep talking.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well done. That was lovely. Okay, now, founded in 1909, the World Road Association, or PIARC, is a not-for-profit group whose purpose is to promote international cooperation on issues relating to roads and road transport. It has members in 140 countries, and as of November 2013, 121 governments, representing every level of economic development, were PIARC members. Now, in 2013, Oscar de Buenriscati was appointed president, bringing with him a background in civil engineering and an expertise in transport and infrastructure. All the right tools to promote PIARC's role of providing an overview of the policies and trends that affect all road users. So could you please welcome Oscar de Buenriscati, president of the World Road Association. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Well, as you have just heard, the World Road Association has member countries all over the world. We are right now 122 countries participating in the works of the association. So a topic such as the one for this session, inclusive transport planning for low density and rural areas, means different things for different countries in the association. And basically we see a very broad and very different approach to the subject depending on the country of which you're talking about. Basically, for example, in more developed and Western Europe, North American countries, the problem here is one of providing efficient services, providing accessibilities, making the best use of available networks in order to make sure that all users have accessibility and a way of moving, a way of getting to where they want, because the infrastructure is there and because services are basically available. However, if you go to lower income countries, even middle income countries, there you find a broader kind of a problem, because in many areas you don't even have the infrastructure. So there is a question of providing the infrastructure and, of course, after that, providing the services. In terms of infrastructure, even if you have it, you definitely need to maintain it. You have to make it resilient against climate change events. And there is a whole lot of problems related to the fact of just making sure that the network that you need in order to provide the services is there. So what does an association such as ours do when facing such a broad and such a diverse kind of a problem? Well, we do have different approaches or different ways in which to try to meet the challenges facing the different countries that belong to our association. For example, in the case of the developed economies, what we do is we do have technical committees who have developed and prepared a series of manuals, and we have a road network operation manual, and we also have an ITS manual that provide information and methodology, let's say, for developing services that allow us to allow countries to make full use of the existing networks in order to provide a broader arrangement of services and a broader choice for people who may be needing these kinds of services in order to have access to other places. In the case of low and middle income countries, we are providing especially tools and available information on ways in which they can develop the networks that will allow them, or the infrastructure that will allow them to provide access to all these isolated places. And also to maintain and to ensure that this infrastructure is available in a condition that allows people to move efficiently. During the latter years, as climate change has become an emerging issue and an issue that merits more and more attention from road administrations, a subject that has come gradually to the fore is how to adapt the available infrastructure and how to make it more resilient in order to ensure that access is provided regardless of what the conditions for movement are. And this gives you, let's say, a broad perspective on what we are working on, which is a reflection of what countries are actually working on in the road sector. And to finalize, I would say that this is clearly an area that is merits a lot of attention, and that, depending on where you are, requires different kinds of initiatives and projects from the respective authorities.
Thank you. That was Oscar de Buen Riscade. Now, José Luis Irigoyen is Director of the Transport and Information and Communications Technologies Global Practice at the World Bank. Founded in 2014, the unit has an active portfolio of $42 billion in lending commitments, 224 projects under supervision, and a similar number of knowledge activities in more than 80 countries. Now, between 2010 and 2013, Mr. Irigoyen led the World Bank's global expert team on public-private partnerships, and prior to that was the senior manager for the Sustainable Development Department of the Africa region, supporting the director in managing the agriculture, energy, environment, and water resource management programs. Could you please welcome José Luis Irigoyen, Director of Transport and ICT Global Practice at the World Bank. The floor, sir, is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will start by building on the connection that Oscar made with regard to the patterns that we often see transport, the demand supply patterns in rural areas, the linkages they have with income levels and population density. So probably they will fall in three categories. This is what we have seen. On the one hand is what we were describing as very low-income areas, and here we cannot talk about countries, we have to talk about areas. Low-income areas where the lack of activity, of economic activity, the lack of vehicles and intermediate means of transport means very limited transport density demand. And this is where you see a trap in terms of insufficient transport services leading to poverty and the isolation trap. Then a second level is higher transport density, where you have low to medium income levels, but associated with economic activity like agriculture, non-agricultural jobs, and so on, where there's plenty of activities and there is a critical mass of services. So this is more likely that we have a market that will function, and probably there will be certain needs to take care of for certain groups, perhaps. But in general, the market can provide a solution. And then the other end is in high-income areas, where you have low to medium transport density, depending on the population density, in which you may have special groups that need to be taken care, and where most of the transport activity takes the form of people who rely on cars. So what you do and how you guarantee services for those that cannot rely on a car. And there, the vicious circle has to do with the financial viability of those services. I think you have touched on the experience in Chile on how you make this service be able to operate. So what I would like now to focus on the first group and bring a development perspective on what are the costs associated with this situation. And clearly, rural accessibility remains at the core of the development agenda from both an economic perspective and also equity perspective. It's an equity issue as well. In 2006, we published some research that showed that 1 billion people didn't have access to an all-weather road. They were living more than 2 kilometers from an all-weather road. And what were the implications, particularly for Africa, where 300 million people at that time were lacking access? This experience was based on using LSMS as a surveys, a household surveys, to determine, say, who had access or not to transportation and to a road. The cost of this we have measured through impact assessment, and here I may have to say that our sector, transport sector, is not leading in terms of a number of impact assessment. We should do a better job from this perspective. But we have done some in the bank, and clearly shows, for example, in Nigeria, a 10% reduction of transport cost led to a 2.6% reduction in multidimensional poverty, 5% increase in local GDP, 0.4% increase in year-round employment. The evidence also shows that, say, access to markets is of the essence. So in Mozambique, for example, or another impact assessment show that if those areas that are living, say, 4 hours, sorry, measured in time, 4 hours from a market, they could realize up to 45% of the full agriculture potential of the area, but those living 8 hours from the market, only 5%. So clearly there is a connection here with the ability of certain regions to compose a sustainable livelihood. The equity perspective, and I want to emphasize this because if you look at the SDGs talk about universal access. So equity now has brought another perspective, a sharper perspective on this issue. What does it mean? SDG 9 is universal access, is resilient infrastructure for all. Social inclusion means the ability of everyone to reach and to engage in activities in composing a livelihood. This implies, most of the cases, transport use, getting to a place, but although it's not the only dimension, you could be isolated as a result not only of spatial concern, but because of age, ethnicity, or other situations. With this perspective, look at, say, how we have traditionally treated rural accessibility and how this has to evolve. Say, countries that have established prescriptions of what the country will do in order to be more equitable in terms of providing accessibility. I think India has the largest rural road program in the world. So they will establish connectivity targets depending on the size of a village, for example. Others will establish how far or how long will it take to reach a bus stop, for example. And if they are bolder, say, a given frequency to that bus service. Actually, the next step in defining accessibility is to further explore, say, what that accessibility will allow you to achieve. What are you accessing? Say, jobs, the job market, schools. And with this perspective, we are doing some work on, for example, on urban areas that tries to measure, for example, what size of the job market you can access from a given location. And this is work that has started in urban context because it's easier to measure it, but we plan to take it to the rural environment. In this context, for example, we did it in Cairo and Buenos Aires, and on average, say in Cairo, you can achieve, say you can reach 15% of the market through public transportation. In the case of Buenos Aires, it's 38. So big difference. So this concept of accessibility and what will have to be considered now as part of the equity. The second part of the equity is that there may be other concerns, like I said before, gender, vulnerable groups that require all the dimensions that have to be part of the rural accessibility appraisal when we do something. And since many times the targets are set with the best of intentions, but not necessarily all the financial means to reach them, you cannot stop at saying, oh, the government, central government will provide the infrastructure, the local government will have to ensure that you meet the target, when the targets require, say, maybe a burden of maintenance that they cannot achieve. Or when you see that there are going to be situations in which important parts of the rural population and maybe probably the extreme poor, you will take ages in reaching those places. So an example in Peru, for example, the highlands of Peru, where because of the mountainous terrain would be very difficult to reach them with engineered roads, we improved tracks. And the tracks serve people walking for 2 days to go to a market and use imported animals that they value a lot. No? So the notion of this accessibility cannot stop at, say, conventional engineering solutions. And a final point here, in terms of the equalized outcomes, we see a tendency, for many countries it will be very difficult to do it, but what we cannot is put aside this agenda. And there's a risk with the current emphasis on climate change, which is very valid, and we are all for it, that say, we define sustainable mobility in a manner that excludes this part of the population. This should not happen, and this is why I applaud this notion of green and inclusive transport. Well, the inclusive part would be in cities, there are a lot of inequalities, some people having different access, and in rural areas, and have to come together. We are doing some interesting research that shows a little bit the way forward. I think Marianne Fay presented in the Outlook session the role that we are doing, the work we are doing on Rural Access Index. It is using technology that is available today. World Pop, for example, allows you to have a distribution of the population with a resolution of 100 meters, so you know where the people live, even in remote areas. Using spatial data now, a lot of countries are digitalizing the networks and the condition of the network, and using the condition of the network to further evaluate the accessibility index. And we are doing this in layers. So for those countries for which we have basic information, we will probably stop at what we had before, how many, say, people live 2 kilometers from an all-weather road. But for places where we can add another layer, we will be able to create in a platform, and most likely an open data platform, to put other services and have a better notion of what this accessibility is.
Right, so I'd like to jump in there, because thank you so much for that, Mr. Irigoyen, because the last speaker, of course, is K. Alpha Pa. He's the founder and chairman of the Asian Institute of Transport Development. Just to tell you a little bit about this organization, it was founded in 1989. It is an independent, not-for-profit body that's focused on non-partisan research, education and training in the area of infrastructure, with a particular emphasis on the transport transport sector. As for Mr. Thapar, he's a former principal advisor with the Indian government's Planning Commission. He's also been recognised internationally for his contributions to promoting inclusive and sustainable development and for his work establishing regional transport networks. And I know that you didn't want to give an overview to the audience about your position on this question, but I want to throw a question to you because a number of themes have arisen from the contributions of our speakers. And clearly, pricing is quite important when you look at the issue of connecting rural areas. But I believe you're concerned that there's a danger for planners particularly that they may overlook the much bigger issues, questions underscoring that.
Thank you very much. It's my understanding that societies must not function on commercial or economic considerations. I don't think it can be anybody's case that the aged who have contributed so much to the society in their working years should be forgotten in their sunset years. It's my view that it is these vulnerable sections of society for whom the state must chip in. We had a wonderful declaration given by the ministers this afternoon, and to my mind, one of the glaring deficiencies was no mention was made of the role of the state. I can imagine that because the ministers normally shy away when it comes to the political economy issues. It is the state whose resources should be deployed for these tiny communities and for the rural areas. In reality, I would say that the time has come that we must reverse the process, and that is the first charge goes to the rural settlements and tiny settlements, and then comes the other areas. They have been neglected for a very long time. I also wish to mention that a time has come to bring a new perspective on the mobility issues of these settlements. And that is, I should say, that the issue of a right. They are entitled to that, and the other word for entitlement is a right. I'll give you an example in this regard from India. There is a tiny settlement in the upper reaches of Himalayas, a small hamlet, one voter only. And at the time of election, the entire machinery of election goes over there. From morning till evening, they wait for this old man to come at his own time. But this expense is worth doing because a right has been exercised. I'm afraid in the transport sector, we have forgotten this thing. And that is what we need to do. I also imagine that in the developed countries, these rural settlements, this inexorable change from the rural areas and settling into the urban areas has come full circle. It was the technology which brought them into the urban areas, and it is the same technology that is of information technology, 3D manufacturing, health delivery services, will rejuvenate these tiny settlements. And it's quite likely that the younger population who will be working from homes, they can go back to the villages and work from there and enjoy a pastoral life. I won't be sounding very much prophetic, but I imagine in the years to come, it will be back to the villages. With regard to the pricing part, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is not that important. The society must subsidize the services wherever they are required. The Honorable Vice Minister from Chile was mentioning that there are competitive demands and all that. Because we are functioning in an economic order which is not conducive for inclusive growth, and it is that economic order which we must challenge. And only then there will be a possibility of inclusive growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, quite a few things there that we can pick up on. And Themba, I'd like to put this to you, the point that was made just now about the change of funding structure. The emphasis has always been with the big urban centres, and he's basically saying, Mr. Thakar, that you have to move it, switch it the other way. I mean, this is something which you're having to deal with now, because as you said at the beginning of your speech, the skew was towards those communities built around the mining areas. So how are you trying to redress that balance, to connect these rural areas, to actually give them the inclusiveness that they deserve? Is it all about money?
Yeah. Thank you. Just before that, we undertook what we called the National Household Travel Survey, so that we can get the numbers. And we have that done every 4 years or so. It's the entire country. It's a statistical analysis that has got economic analysis in it. And we want evidence-based kind of decisions to describe and know the numbers behind who is rural and what are they doing. How long does it take for them to reach where they're going, etc. And we also have, I'm glad from the World Bank side, we also have a rural accessibility index study that we've done so that we know the levels of access and the types of access or exclusion are not the same. So based on that, we have devised a strategy which at first is in economic order. That is, retain as much as possible of what is already in the area there, like mines.
So using the existing infrastructure?
We are investing in infrastructure to have what we call beneficiation. Rather than export all the time, give opportunities for people to earn the money where they are, along the value chain, rather than extract and export. And also around agriculture, we are encouraging agri-processing units so that people do not have to wait for the eight hours, which is the point I took from this side, the 4 hours, which is a better time, but you also have an opportunity now to process those things. So we are investing a lot on that. This is another way of pricing, in a way, because we are making those who are able to work, who are living in those rural areas, because it's not like in the rural areas it's only old people or people who can't work. Some of them would like to look after the people who are at home in the rural areas. So we encourage that kind of beneficiation and agri-processing. Coming to the hot topic of how that is now without economic order, which is now the right. That is, you can go for even one voter and spend resources because it's a right, it's a commitment we have to do as humanity. We have a very good model of empowering local municipalities to take those decisions on their own. So even though as transport we are at national level, we have very clearly defined duties and work from national through provincial to local municipalities. And we have targets, and ministers have to report on those targets to make sure that these things do happen. But money is never enough. In the end, it's the choice that the decision maker will have to make. And our duty is to influence the decision makers towards that. But we are moving a lot into saying people can stay where they are. It's their choice. Because the basic thing, as you know, in South Africa, we have one of the best constitutions in the world, possibly, and the Bill of Rights. And that is what is driving us. And it sometimes is forcing us, if we forget, we are reminded by it, that this is what we have adopted some 20 years ago when we had the new democracy.
Right, so transport is basically a right, and the way that you've organised the financing really underpins that. It tries to reflect it. But that's the South African experience. It's not the experience that is replicated in other parts of the world. I mean, you talked about, for example, Christian, the need to have this competitiveness, that if you've got this competitiveness amongst the technology suppliers, that they will try to find a pricing structure that will suit all communities. And I guess the problem there, whilst it's great on the one hand, the problem is that if you've got these technology companies which want to pick up the slack, the government can say, great, let's stand back, these guys can deal with it.
It's not that way. I would say that, first of all, this is not, when you subsidize a service, the government is involved, obviously, and we are regulating and we are changing providers if they are not accomplishing, because there is a special, this is like a kind of a sort of right that we need to provide.
But how much should governments give?
And if you understand this, the connectivity as a right, you need to provide it, and you need to find a way in which you can do it. What I'm trying to say is that you need to find ways in which you can create the lowest necessary required cost in order to provide that right. And that is why we are doing. Actually, we have a bidding process, and there are operators that go over there. Sometimes there is only one operator, and you need to find a way in which you can create packages of services in which are more competitive in order to have more providers and more competition. But after that, the responsibility of that movement of people from one isolated area to another one at an affordable price with a good comfort is mine, well, not mine, but of the government. And I guess that you can't forget that this is your role from the public sector.
But it has to start from, as Mr. Thapar was saying, a moral perspective, recognising it as a right. But I guess that we can talk about the costings, but it becomes more of a challenge because you've got scattered populations and every group has different needs. So it's creating that system which connects, but it serves people of differing wants. Who would like to tackle that point? Would you like to tackle that? Share the mic.
Well, no, it's clearly first a question of providing the access and then focusing on the different needs of people who may have special needs or special requirements. I think that overall well, at least in low and middle income countries, the question is more access, is helping to fight poverty, helping to provide access to basic services, helping to make people be able to reach schools, hospitals, ways in which they can sustain themselves. And I agree, it's more a question of a state responsibility to make all that possible. But that is, I think, a first stage in the whole process. As development takes place and as people are able to sustain or to meet their basic needs, then all other necessities and other needs are going to appear. And I think that that is where other more specialized needs can be met or can be, well, looked after. But I think that many countries in the world have not yet reached that kind of a stage. It's probably the case of developed economies or developed countries, but in even middle-income countries, they do have a backlog of infrastructure in good condition that will allow them to reach those isolated rural areas. And, well, how to develop those services, how to sustain them, how to make sure that the quality is, or the even ahead of quality, that the availability is there. I think that is a first step or a first concern that needs to be met in order for some social needs to be met, and that is a permanent challenge that has to be constantly met. And hopefully, at some point in time, concern will go more to the side of the services than to the infrastructure.
It's certainly part of the solution, or a large part of it, is this thing called big data, the gathering of numbers to actually shape transport platforms. But then technology is never constant. It is always changing, and that puts incredible pressure on those responsible for constructing this transport service, the one that connects, to actually keep pace with what is going on. And that's another problem to throw into the field. I mean, what's your take on that, Jose?
I'm glad that you asked me, because we are transport and ICT as a global practice. So we have seen the importance
You're a natural
of
for this question.
connecting the two. Clearly, when you think about what you can do with the new technology, information and communication technology, is amazing. The power of matching supply and demand and reducing costs by relying on technology. Part of the challenge in rural areas is the availability of these platforms. And although mobile phones, for example, was a big success in Africa and surprised everyone as the Africans, even those living in rural areas, consider a mobile phone part of the assets they have, the penetration of smartphones that allow you the most sophisticated solutions is still 30% in rural areas in Africa, smartphones. Nevertheless, it's showing, I think, the way forward, and what you are seeing that is happening in peripheral urban areas could be, say, with time, be transposed to the rural settings. What you see is that technology will allow to better match supply and demand and give enormous flexibility. For example, when you talk about competitive services and complementary services for those who have vulnerable groups or have special needs, what we call demand responsive transport has evolved enormously. And now the flexibility you have in terms of defining the itinerary or the route, defining what type of vehicle has to provide the service, defining who are the users, and now thinking more integrated, because the users could be picked and could be the one that has a special need and could be others that could enhance the viability of the service. All this that in the past had to be fixed before can be done almost in real time, very efficiently. So this is clearly showing a way forward. And I will say that the power will come from this ability to match. If, for example, operators can share information and can create the platforms, the cost will go down. And the ability to influence behaviors. Say today, it's cool to share services. No? In the past, in rural areas, the taxis, the colectivo, with many users and so on, was common practice. So it was not new for the rural areas, but it's something is coming up now in urban settings. The ability to influence behaviors by providing better information, for example, enhancing the experience of using the services. In rural areas, in the past, women will have to stay on the road and wait, who knows for how long until a bus will pass. Well, now today you can know when it's going to happen. And also the ability to think of smarter subsidies. That has, I think, has enormous potentials. More and more countries have safety nets that say you know who the poor are, and you can design subsidies that they could decide how they spend. And with the ICT solutions, smart card, for example, they can use for accessing services. I think this is where there is a revolution in the making, and that little by little we'll get to rural areas.
Okay, so that's one way of using the big data. But the other intriguing thing that I've come across as I've been reading about this subject is that for some people in very rural areas, they do have access to cars, and there is an assumption perhaps on the part of some transport planners that they don't perhaps need to look at alternatives because the car is always the default position. So the question is, how do you change that? Who'd like to tackle that question? Who feels brave enough? Yeah, sure, go for it.
I see in the case of the developed world, the access is there. The question is providing the services, and that also to the tiny settlements or smaller villages. And there, the information technology can play an important role. You marry the information technology with the transport services, and you can get a demand-driven, flexible transport services, which will provide the solution for these rural areas which are presently neglected. In the case of the developing countries, the one issue is providing the access itself. For instance, in India, well, now 50 years back, only 20% of the villages were connected. We are 0.56 million villages. And I'm proud to say that 97% of them are now connected with the roads, all-weather roads. And that now they are moving. The next question will be providing the transport services for them. And then there are myriad solutions over there. But the point which I am highlighting is that the public service obligation of the state or that of the providers must be there. My good friend from South Africa was mentioning that they have given the responsibility to the municipalities. Well, that is a nice thing to do. You distance yourself from a problem. Because, as he himself said, that the money is a big problem. All municipalities all over the places are faced with that problem, raising the issues. What we are discussing over here is the inclusive provision of transport services for the rural areas, not for municipalities. And that is the crucial part of it, that how do I get it? And I also visualize, as I mentioned in the beginning, that in the case of the developed world, it may be a question of going back to the villages. But in the case of the developing country, there is every case to provide the urban services in the rural areas so that the level of migration goes down. This inexorable thinking that we are having, that people must migrate to the urban areas to get a level of economic growth, is a myth. And sooner it is exploded, it is better. Because we keep on talking in this very session during the last, you can say, a day and a half, I have been hearing numbers like that. In 2050, it's very easy to, to talk about 50 years hence. 70% of the population of the world will be looking in urban areas. In one session, it was 64. In another session, it was 54. Now, what amazes me is that no one, you make a premise that this will be the numbers that will be there. And then you raise these issues over there and you say these are the... I am only saying, why don't we able to reverse this process?
So have a more joined up system so people can stay or even go back to the rural areas because everything is connected.
Or provide the services to those rural areas where people start living around over there. They don't move. Who wants to settle down in all these ghettos of Latin America or Asia? It is a disgrace to the humanity when we say that I am raising your level of economic growth, but you are putting them into such misery that you cannot imagine.
Sure.
And then we say we address the issues of all these ghettos, and we are talking of crime and things and so forth.
Right. Okay. Did you want to interject on this, Jose? Because I know that this is an issue which is very close to your heart, because we were talking before this debate began about the impact of spatial isolation.
It's a reality. I think urbanization is one of the most, one of the drivers of this 21st century, and it's irreversible. What I think, what good policies, rural accessibility policies will do, and this is very, very important, is to keep rural economies flourishing so that urbanization will not take place just going to the capital city and becoming a mega city impossible to manage. Some cities are so big that are starting to push business out of the city, but rather to go to regional cities, secondary cities that could become engines for growth. And this is also the beauty of transport. That when you invest in a rural area, you are contributing to both sides. You are contributing to re-energizing the rural economies, but also you are contributing to an urbanization process that is more efficient.
Okay, I know that Oscar wants to interject as well. Please, Oscar.
Yeah, I wanted to...
Is your microphone on?
I just want to add something to this idea with the case of Mexico as an example. Mexico had, in 1960, the country had 33 million inhabitants. And of those, about half, which means 17 million, lived in urban areas and the other half in rural areas. Today, which is only, less than 60 years afterward, after 1960, the country has 125 million inhabitants, of which about 100 million, slightly less, live in urban areas. This means that the quantity of people living in rural areas, even though as a percentage has gone very, very much down, maybe today it's about 20% or some, maybe even less, 15%, but the number in absolute terms has gone up. So even if you have a very large number of people living in urban areas, you still have a very large number of people living in rural areas, maybe 50 or 60% more people than the ones that you had in the 60s. So what does this mean in terms of providing access? Well, you definitely have to ensure that some infrastructure is there to provide access to all those communities. And as you go along, as the country becomes more higher income and can afford it, you definitely have to focus on services and how to improve on those basic services that you had originally. Because I think that first, the whole tendency of moving towards the cities has already taken place to a large extent. So it's not a question as to whether we can afford not to have that tendency or not. But also, it's a question of, even though it has happened, you still have quite a lot of population in rural areas that need services and need to be taken care for. So I think that, this makes the whole question more complicated. We definitely need public policies that orient these kinds of developments. And how to do it, that's part of the reason why we're here.
Because, with the Chilean experience, you've embraced most of this. You're moving on, you've set your timelines, you have the connectivity, and also bringing in people. You mentioned, for example, the youngsters in your presentation who were excluded. They're coming into the cities. They have that mobility. They have the life improvement.
Well, it's not necessarily to the cities. This could be at some places, communities where live, 100 people, and they move to a town where live 1,000 people.
Sure.
So finally is how to give them a better access to opportunities that they didn't have before. And about the trend of population moving to the cities, it's something that we can't avoid. Even when we have very good schools in these towns and we have hospitals, or not hospitals, but little centers of health, still, for example, if they want to go to the university, it's not rational to have a university in a town of 1,000 people. That would be a counterfactor. So finally, we need to provide transportation, and transportation becomes a mean of equality, a mean of opportunities, a mean of creating value for the economies. So finally, we need to think about what is happening in our world and trying to create opportunities. About big data and the connection, I think that big data is much more important in places where you have a big data, a big amount of data. In rural areas or things like that, you have, for example, the frequency of that chip is 5 times a month. So it's very, you can do something with demand and offer, but it still is a very clear schedule and not so likely to be like adjusted demand and offer, for example. So I guess that the discussion about big data is most important in cities, in shanty towns or places that are in the city ghettos, close to the cities, more than in this kind of zones that are very isolated zones.
Right, so it's how you use the data, the application. But look, one other point that I want to raise with the panel before we throw it open to you guys is this whole question about regulation, in particular with taxi services, the idea that perhaps the use of them is made a bit more adaptable. A lot of people cite what happened in Sweden when they relaxed the rules for car owners to actually operate their vehicles as taxis. From the South African perspective, is that something that would perhaps draw the connectivity that you're looking for? The question about taxis, about the use of cars, taking the Swedish example where they relaxed the rules for car owners to operate their vehicles as taxis. It comes back to the question of regulation. Is that something which the South Africans are also looking at?
Yes, just to give some numbers, about 65% of daily commuting in South Africa is in the hands of taxis, not subsidized. It's a very natural way. They grew up, they are organized, and it's working. The only thing to do is to regulate for safety and also to institute taxation mechanisms and the greening of that, and by promoting use of alternative fuels. So I'm saying it's happening on a large scale anyway from that end. So, but we haven't moved to saying that maybe people who have private cars to become taxis. I think it's still well subscribed at the moment at the rate at which it's going. But if you allow me to just go back a bit, the two questions here about local municipalities is to separate. The subsidy is done nationally and is determined nationally by the National Treasury, and there are conditional grants that go to the municipalities. So it's not like abdicating from your duty to provide the basic right. It's just to say it's an assignment of duties because you have a trade-off. You cannot be at national level and determine everything for local. So this is where the difference is. So yeah, that's what it is. Thank you.
Okay, it's at this point that I'd like to throw this out to the audience. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? Lady at the front, can we bring a microphone to her, please? The lady here. Over here. He's running. Great. Gentlemanly thing to do. Could you start by introducing yourself, please, and the organization you represent? Is your microphone on?
Now it works?
Yeah. It is working now.
My name is Merav Moran. I'm from Tel Aviv. I'm a journalist. I work for Globes, which is the Financial Times of Israel. It's the biggest economic newsletter. And my question is to, I hope I pronounce the name, Tapar. I think that's, I hope I pronounce it well. I was wondering regarding what you said about having the same transportation on the same services in the rural area as well as they have in the urban city, in urban area. If you ever calculate, if you put, I don't know, 1 rupee, maybe 1 rupee is a very small amount, but 100 rupees in transportation in rural areas, how much it will, what would you gain compared to what you get for 100 rupees if you put it, invest 1 rupees in urban area? Did you ever calculate that?
This question has been addressed several times. Wherever there is excess, there is less poverty. The literacy rate goes up, the health, access to the health, people, infant mortality goes down. If you invest in rural areas where there is a deprivation, naturally there will be a much better return that will come. So it's not a question of investing 100 rupees here and 100 rupees over there. The basic question is that how do we provide services over there? Now, a point was being made that how do we provide job opportunities in the rural areas. I'll give you only one small example. If there is a 24/7 electricity supply to a village and the water is available, there are thousands of villages in the province of Gujarat from which the present Prime Minister come, where the diamond polishing is done. The diamonds are, the biggest market is Antwerp. It comes over there, and all are distributed into the villages where the people have the job opportunities to do it in a village. But it also means better law and order. So the opportunities there can be any number of examples with regard to this. For instance, I'll give you one more example of dairy farming. The largest in the world, 1.5 lakh, you can say almost 0.1 million farmers. They contributed 1 liter to 2 liters of milk in a society from a village, which is collected, which is pasteurized, distributed into the urban areas and into the rural areas. The point simply is two things. One, provision of transport services is not only the preserve of the technicians. It's a larger societal issues which need to be addressed. One of the points which is made in the ministerial declaration is that the transport and the planning, spatial planning must be done accordingly. What I am trying to put across is, please use the word not only spatial urban planning, but the rural planning as well, because that will give you much better returns, what you are looking for in rupees investments.
Okay, can I jump in now, because I believe there are other people who'd like to ask a question. There's a lady there. Could you raise your hand a bit higher? There, that lady there. And again, if you can introduce yourself and the organization you represent or publication.
Sure. My name is Christina Yasunata, and I'm representing World Bicycle Relief. It's an international NGO that provides mobilizes people, mostly in the developing countries, through the power of bicycles. Well, I felt like I kept nodding all the session here, just a fantastic group, and also compliments to the forum by introducing such a session, because I feel that many forums or congresses just miss to highlight this importance of transportation or missing transportation in the rural areas. So compliments for that. So maybe just to share one results that on the study from India, where it has been measured if bicycles make difference if girls receive bicycles to get to the secondary school, and the study showed that this is 30% of increase in enrollment and 40% increasement in the gender gap. We also see similar results in Zimbabwe, where girls are provided bicycles. We just got a study from Zambia where we saw that farmers, dairy farmers who have bicycles, that they bring 23% milk to the dairy cooperatives. So all the discussions that have been on the podium are just to make so much sense. From our side, we see that there's still not too much recognition on the power that bicycle has. So my question to the group would be, where do you see bicycle in your work, and what priority does it have? And if you feel it's on the right priority level. Thanks.
Okay, so the power of the bicycle, is it a priority? Christian.
Well, thank you for your intervention. And thank you for your intervention. It wasn't. Bicycle is very important in transportation, at least in Chile. But you need to be aware of some things that happen. For example, in Chile, in rural areas, there are many dirt roads that get wet when it rains.
Sorry, dirt roads?
Dirt roads.
Dirt roads, yeah, sure.
So when you have wet dirt roads, kids cannot go to the school, and we had a problem with attendance. And when we created at some point these buses, transporting people, kids, finally our attendance rate increased. And that meant a better education for those kids. So finally, not always biking is a good idea, but it's a policy that we are promoting, especially in cities and in rural areas where it is possible because you have good roads and infrastructure and safety also for the kids, because where there is, I don't know, no public lights at night, could be a problem of safety for that kid using the bike, even when they are using some reflective material. So you need to be aware of that, but we are considering for sure that biking is one of the things that we need to promote, and for sure, mainly for urban area, is something that we need to promote considerably because of the results in environmental issues and congestion also.
Okay, so I believe that two other comments. Could you go first, then yourself?
Yeah, quickly on the bicycle, in South Africa, we have a program called Shova Galula. Shova is to bike. Galula means easily. So we have a program for that, and we encourage, especially among the scholars in the areas where the access otherwise is very limited or non-existent, to get to school. And it's supported by a lot of training and a lot of interaction with the adults and the parents to look after and to make it sustainable. We have stopped importing many of those. We are now manufacturing them in-house. So we are serious about bicycles, but we are not at Amsterdam level yet.
Right, so the bike hasn't been squeezed out. Would you care to comment, Mr. Sakar?
Yes, I see the bicycle in future also, given my years of what is left of me now. But one thing I wish to mention, and I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, that in some of the states in India, the government gave the bicycles free to the girls. Their enrollment of the girls went up substantially. Their dropouts from the school gone down substantially. But more important than that is the bicycle to be used as a empowerment tool for the woman, and particularly in societies which are not that free, where they won't like a girl to drive to bicycle. If you encourage a girl to go on a bicycle, even with a hijab, it empowers that woman, it empowers that girl. And that is an important message.
Okay. One thing which I would like to ask about actually is these ride services, because when we think about ride services, they tend to have that urban setting, the likes of the Ubers and the Lyft, etc. And is a similar concept compatible with rural areas? Who'd like to tackle that? Would you like to tackle that, Oscar? Sure. It is, when we talk about connecting transport services, one of the dimensions that's brought into the narrative are the new ride services like Uber, like Lyft, etc. But we tend to associate them with urban settings. Can that concept work in rural areas, or do the demographics go against its success? I think we have a few microphone problems. It's there, it's gone. Excellent.
Well, I think it's clearly a different situation, because in urban areas you have high volumes typically, you have more regular commute, you have more availability of infrastructure, whereas in rural areas you may not have the same kind of regularity of demands and the same supply, quality of supply, both from infrastructure and from services. I think that in rural areas it's more a question of providing the means to access a series of services that may not be directly available in the locality of which you are talking about. So the example that Christian was mentioning, you have the child who has to go maybe not to primary school, but to secondary school. And you don't have any available secondary school in that locality, so he has to move to the next town. But the next town, well, maybe 40 or 30 kilometers away. So it's not something that you would go back and forth, especially if you are a 10 or 11-year-old child or youth. So maybe what happens is that you need to go once and you stay with some relatives and with some. There are some social networks that provide support to these kinds of people, but they need to get there. So maybe you do it once a week or once a month or something like that, but of course you cannot do it if there is no way in which you can access that larger town. I think in rural areas, in low and middle income countries, that is sort of like a more typical kind of issue than going back and forth every day to school, such as you would have in an urban area. And of course, this has an influence, or it makes the kind of service and the kind of infrastructure that you need, it makes it different.
Let's hold that thought, because this gentleman here, if you'd care to introduce yourself, yeah, so if we can have a microphone for this gentleman. This is an area that is just up your street.
Yes.
So please introduce yourself.
So my name is Adam Parkin, and I'm with Black Lane, professional driver service. So we're in about 200 cities around the world, and we're starting to expand to some more long-distance rides and to look at what it means to connect not only cities to one another, but also connect some rural areas with transportation hubs that could be in urban centers or in suburban areas as well. My question is related to regulations. So it sounds like there are some things that you allow in rural areas that you may not allow in urban areas. For example, in Chile, if there's only one company that bids for a service, you may allow that to go forward, where in an urban area, you might require multiple people to bid. Or in you mentioned the Swedish example, where in rural areas they allowed people to become taxi drivers. So at national levels, when you think about regulatory approaches, are you willing to make exceptions for rural areas to provide this this equity and this inclusivity, or how do you balance the fairness with regulations that might need to be on a national level so that there's equity among all of the different types of transportation providers who would want to provide service across an entire country?
Okay, who'd like to tackle that? Christian.
Regulatory issues are complicated, and the first thing is that obviously a rural area, in transportation at least, is much less regulated than an urban area. We have different requirements for providing transportation in Santiago than in Cabreros or Los Angeles or the places what I told before. So there is a much more flexibility in rural areas than in the cities. But given said that, you still need to have some common rules. For example, you need the safety belt in the buses, and you need to do it even if you are doing a scholar trip in I don't know where. So finally, there are some national rules, and there are some flexibilities in rural areas, not because we are promoting flexibility, but because there was an increasing regulatory requirements, higher regulatory requirements in urban cities.
Okay. Would you care to add something to that? Any other member of the panel? The point about regulation, that you may have to be changeable. What works? What may work for a city might not necessarily work for a rural area. Would anyone care to add to that? Jose.
Fully agree
Sure.
with your point. Perhaps with time, what we are going to see is also say that to adequate the regulations to, for example, the new platforms that could become available. I think also another trend would be not necessarily from the regulation point of view, but actually from the planning point of view. Say, instead of say, overcoming the fragmentation in terms of the special services, and technology may bring solutions to that, and that may require also, say, governments planning differently, and then operators sharing information on doing work differently. I like also the point that Oscar made about the location of facilities, because when we talk about accessibility, we tend to think in compartments, again, an issue of fragmentation. So the agency in charge of looking at schools will have to think about special services for children and so on, but tend to be done in isolation. And I think there is a trend to think more holistically about, say, what is available, and through the increased flexibility of this demand-responsive transport, you will be able to reduce the cost in providing that service. And finally, if I may...
very briefly, so that we can take another
question.
Very
briefly. I mentioned intermediate means of transport, and also, for example, how we address in a project in Peru with the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank working together, the issue of even people walking in highlands of Peru, in the Andes. They play a critical role, and no one, say, if you have gone to these rural areas, the power of a bicycle, say, they are carrying a weight, and truly exports are done with bicycles and tricycles and so on. So this notion of being more, to think more broadly in terms of what are the means of transport that, say, rural people can access, it's a part of the menu, and you have we have done some publications in this respect.
Okay, the gentleman over there.
Good evening. My name is Arndt Betzner from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Not that I want to hijack this meeting, but given all these passionate testimonials that we heard today and this very important question that also, by the way, also the city's problems are alleviated if we attack the rural problems in a structured form. Let me please very quickly say that in this fall, in September, the Transportation Research Board, which is the transportation arm of the National Academies in Washington, D.C., they are organizing a very specialized conference on demand-responsive transit, which tackles at the convergence between all those modes. What can medical transportation learn from taxis? What can Uber technology provide for fixed route buses?
Can I jump in for one moment, please? Could you slow down?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I just wanted to say. I wanted to be very quick. Sorry. This conference is taking place in September in Breckenridge, Colorado. It's organized by TRB. I'm on the steering committee. If anybody's interested, I'll be at the end of the session in the back of the room.
Right,
Please feel
so
free to approach
you're making an announcement about a conference in Washington which is relevant to the subject that we've been discussing.
Which tackles exactly the questions that we asked
right,
here.
And at the end of it, if people want to sign up for that conference, you'll be over there.
Exactly, thank you so much.
Brilliant, we got it. Okay, before we part company, does anyone want to ask another final question? Speak now, forever hold your peace. The gentleman over here, please. Could you say who you are and the organization you represent?
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. I am Mohamed Ben Khaddam. I will speak in French. Sorry, because I will not...
Mohamed bin Hassan of the Ministry for Transport and Logistics in Morocco. I have the following question for the president of the PIARC and the representative of the World Bank. In Morocco, we have two programs for road transport that we have launched, one from 1995 to 2005. We have created a road network, and then after 2025 to 2015, we have launched a new program, and we have provided the funds through particular bonds and guarantees from the World Bank, for which we are very grateful, and also other international donors. And in these 20 years, we have provided 25,000 kilometers of roads in the rural areas in Morocco, 35% more, 95 to 2005, and then another addition of more than 80%. The problem that we are facing now is the maintenance of these rural roads, because the rural roads are not maintained by the state, they are maintained by the communities. So the question we are facing is whether the PIARC and the World Bank have an idea of a strategy for how the developing countries can be empowered to maintain these rural roads. And after several tries, we haven't found a solution to that yet.
The gentleman was talking about a road programme which was funded by bonds, also money from the World Bank. 25,000 kilometres of roads in rural areas of Morocco have been created. They're working very well, but the problem is maintenance. The maintenance of rural roads, they are not maintained by the state or the government. It falls to local communities. So the question is, how can local communities be empowered to maintain the roads? You are chomping at the bit. Your territory. Go for it, Oscar.
For the question, well, we at the World Road Association, this is one of the main topics that we address. We do have a number of publications, and our Secretary General is sitting in the back. He can make a sign there, and we will be happy to talk to you in more detail about this. But let me tell you that there are a number of, well, this is a worldwide issue. Many countries in the world do have a problem, not only of maintenance of rural roads, but also of maintenance of roads. And that is an area that is generating a lot of work and a lot of attention. There is a full field of activity called asset management that focuses specifically on how to do a better job of maintaining roads of all types. And we do have a number of technical committees and a number of publications that are addressing this subject. So I'll be more than happy to discuss this with you. Morocco is obviously a country that belongs to our association, so we can provide all sorts of information for that concern.
Okay, so it sounds like you two will have a lot to talk about. But I know that, Jose, you wanted to add something to this as well.
Very quickly, first, what a nice program you have there. It was one of the first where we did an impact assessment and put very clear, say, how improving rural accessibility had benefit girls attending school. Your point is very well taken. Say the issue of rural accessibility is who will do the maintenance afterwards. And say local governments have two issues: capacity to undertake the maintenance, and which requires thinking about the delivery mechanisms for maintenance, and then the financing. We have done in some project combination of some routine maintenance provided by communities, for example, and the very low cost kind of contracts, and then complemented by mechanic maintenance done by a company or by the state. But it's an issue that cannot be left to have to be considered at the very beginning. And in some projects, when we introduce some innovative ways, we have included also the design and sometimes even financing for several years of this kind of maintenance in some projects in the bank. So we can further discuss options, but this is a very relevant topic. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And the final word, Mr. Thakkar, would you like to have the final word? I believe you wanted to say something on which to close.
I would rather mention that one of the areas which we have not explored is the cooperative social effort to be made at the community level or at the village level. If you remember good old days, the religion used to play an important role, and that was on the basis of a moral imperative. They used to provide social services for the communities. And here also, if the villages and the communities, the social services can be provided, supported by the state to some extent, then several of these problems which we are grappling with will be addressed. So the one message to be given over there is the need for empowering the local communities and the villages to go into the cooperative services and the state to facilitate that the denominational role for those services to flourish. Thank you.
Okay, so the partnership there. Final word. Who goes first? So second from final word and then the final word. Please go for it.
The most important thing is the package in which you put all of this. Each country has got its own, and in my country, in South Africa, it's the triple challenge of income equality. We've got a lot of that to address. Poverty eradication, which is mainly on the low density and rural areas, and unemployment. So all of these things have to fit into those national imperatives.
Okay, and Jose.
Just in concluding, that whenever we talk about sustainable transport, sustainable mobility, we cannot do that if we don't put the inclusive access. And this inclusive access has to refer to both urban and rural settings.
But as we've heard today, in the time that we've been together, those moves are underway. We've seen the efforts in Chile. Congratulations, it's an ongoing project. And of course, don't forget the roads, the importance of roads and maintenance as well, as we've just discussed, and the moral imperative that traffic is a right. It is a struggle in South Africa, but you're doing all the right things. You're getting there. And of course, the World Bank involved in a number of these projects, making it happen, as we saw in the example of Morocco. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I wish you all a very good evening. And thank you to our panel of experts. Gentlemen, thank you.